Good morning, everyone. I am not there today. I have a substitute, but we're going to go ahead and continue our notes from what we started yesterday and finish it up today. So today we're going to be talking about the coordinate plane. If you haven't already done so, please make sure that you have turned in your homework into the turn-in bin or to the sub. And please make sure that your notes are out, as you are going to be taking notes while you watch this video. So if your notes aren't out, please go ahead and pause the video, get out your notes, and get ready to get started. When you're ready, hit play. Today we're talking about the coordinate plane. The coordinate plane, like I always say, math always has big fancy words, and the coordinate plane is a big fancy word for a graph. The actual definition is a graph created by the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis and the y-axis, if you look at the graph, are these two very dark lines. These dark lines are the x-axis and the y-axis. They are basically number lines. So the x-axis, which I'm highlighting here in yellow, is basically a number line that you always see. It starts at 0, to the right is positive, and to the left is negative. And then you have the y-axis, which I've highlighted here in green, which is a number line just up and down, like we talked about before. Towards the top are the positives, and the bottom is the negatives. These two axes create what's called four quadrants. That's another vocabulary word. These quadrant is basically a big fancy word for saying section. Each of these have a name called a quadrant, and there are four of them. Quadrant 1 is this one. Quadrant 2 is the top left corner, the top left quadrant. Quadrant 3, I know these are big fancy names. Quadrant 3 is the bottom left, and quadrant 4 is the bottom right. Now you have this chart over here, and yours is not filled in, so we're going to fill this in. Quadrant 1 will always have coordinates of x, y that are positive. And I guess before I do that, let's first talk about what an ordered pair is. An ordered pair is another vocabulary word for saying a point. It basically is an exact location where we're going to plot points. An ordered pair is always written with parentheses and a comma. The first number is always the number that's correlated with the x-axis, the number that's horizontal, or I should also say left-right. The second number is always the y, which correlates with the vertical, which is the up-down number line. It is always written x and then y, simply because it's alphabetical and we have to keep it the same. So again, it's written with parentheses and a comma, x and then y. So we go left, right, and then we go up, down. And if you recall yesterday, I related it to an airplane. If you think about when you're flying on an airplane, you need to get speed and then you can take off. And the same thing with the ordered pair. The first number is going to tell us our speed, how far left or right to go, and our second number is going to tell us how far up or down we have to go. Okay, so that's ordered pairs. And then, so we have quadrant 1, which, as we talked about, is this upper right-hand corner. If you think about it, in order to graph in this section, your x-axis, so this yellow highlighted, has to be in the positive world. And your y, which is the green, has to be in positive as well in order for it to meet in this section. So our quadrant 1 will always be positive. An example would be 2, 3. In order to graph 2, 3, our first number tells us to go right 2, so we go to the 2 on the x. And then our second number tells us to go to the 3 on the y, which is located right there. And we have our 2, 3, which is quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, if you think about it, has to be in the negatives for the x, and it will be in the positives for the y. So we wrote negative, positive. An example is -1, 4. So over here I go to the -1, because it says -1, and then it says 4. So I go up 4. And this is quadrant 2. Quadrant 3, if you think about it, is all negative. So the x has to be negative and the y has to be negative. It has to be to the left and then down. And so if I look at quadrant 3, it will always be negative, then negative. An example is -5, -2. Now to graph this, again, our first number tells us to go left, and it tells me to go left to -5 because it's a negative, and negative numbers are to the left of 0. So I go to the left, -5, and then it tells me to go down to -2. And the reason why it's down is because it's negative. So then down to -2, and I have my point of quadrant 3. Quadrant 4 is positive, then negative, because the x's actually are positive and the y's are the negative. An example here I gave is 1, -3. So I'm going to go over 1 and down 3. And that's quadrant 4. Again, I want to be very particular and make sure that you guys, very specific, and make sure you guys understand that when you're looking for ordered pairs or you're having to graph an ordered pair, that first number tells you to go left or right, and the second number tells you to go up or down. It's important that you do that in that order, otherwise you may get a point in ordered pair that is completely opposite of what it needs to be. Okay. All right, so we have our second graph, and on the second graph it asks us to do a couple of things. It asks us to identify ordered pairs. I want you to go ahead and, or actually no, I want you to do this with me. So number 1, you'll notice that in this particular section of this graph, not all of the points are at specific intersections. A lot of them are halfway in between. And that's because we're in 6th grade and we know what we're doing, and we need to make sure that we understand how to graph even if we aren't given a whole number or an integer. So point C, if I look for C, is right here. Point C, if I think, where is it on the x-axis? Well, how far right did I go? I went to 1, but I went past 1. I didn't get to 2, so I'm in between 1 and 2. A number that is in between 1 and 2, halfway in between, is 1.5. So we're going to look at that as 1.5. And then how far up did I go? I went 1 exact. So the point for C is 1.5, 1. And that would be our ordered pair. You can write that as a fraction of 1 and then a half and then 1, or you can write it as 1.5 and 1. It is up to you. What quadrant is letter C in? Hopefully we are all aware that this quadrant up here, the positive land, is quadrant 1. Okay. Now, identify the point at -1.5, -1. So that first number, again, tells me to go left 1.5. So I'm going to go left to -1.5. Well, that's -1, and then I have to go halfway more. And then I need to go down -1. Well, I've landed at letter point B. So that ordered pair represents letter B. What quadrant is letter B in? Well, if it's a negative and a negative, according to our chart, negative and then a negative it must be quadrant 3. We also could just know that it's quadrant 3 because we know this is 1, and then we go counterclockwise like a clock would do. We go counterclockwise. We go quadrant 1, quadrant 2, 3, and 4. All right. Pause this video. If you have any questions, I want you to ask the sub. We're going to keep going, but if you have any questions, again, I want you to raise your hand and ask the sub. We're going to turn the page. We're actually going to skip this one for today, and we are going to go to this next one. Graphing and identifying ordered pairs are very similar, and they go together, so we're going to do them together. Alrighty. So, graphing. We've already done this. We know how to do this. Graph point M at -3, 5. Well, -3 tells me how far to go, left or right. I'm going to try and do this here. This one, let's make sure I got the right. There we go. Okay, so -3 tells me how far to go left or right, and 5 tells me how far to go up or down. The first numbers always tell us to go left or right, and the second numbers always tell us how far to go up or down. And so that's a good indicator of what we're supposed to be doing. So point M is at -3, so we go to -3 and then up to 5. When I graph point M, you'll notice that I wrote an M with it. In order for you to graph appropriately, you also need to label. So we're labeling it with the letter M because it says graph point M. Number 2 says graph N at -2.5, -3.5. This one's a little different, and I want you to pay very close attention to this one. -2.5 is between -2 and -3. And -3.5 is in between -3 and -4. You'll notice that this ordered pair is in the middle of the box. That is because both of those points, or both of those x's and y's, have a half. So because they're both fractions, it ends up in the middle. Okay, again, if you have any questions, I want you to raise your hand. Otherwise, I want you to try these next 4, where it says graph and label the following P, Q, R, and S. I want you to pause the video, do this on your own. When you've got all of them, I want you to hit play and see if you got them correct. Okay, so you should have graphed them, and I've been having trouble with this one for some reason. There it is. And let me just... So, there are your P, Q, R, and S. P should be up here. Q should be down here on the actual y-axis. R should be here, and S should be over here. That should be more on the line. It's going to let me move it. Oop, there we go. S should be there. 4.5, 1. Sorry, wasn't quite on the line, so I'm just fixing it. The Q, I want to go over this Q1. This Q1 is the only one that I ever see any issues with. This one's the letter Q. Q, the first number is 0. The first number is 0. That simply means I'm not going anywhere left or right, and I simply just went straight down to where the -4 was. So it's not making me make a straight line. Okay, we're just gonna leave that there. So again, Q just went straight down, and that's where Q is. This concludes our notes for today. We're not going to go down and do this next, the reflections. We'll do the reflections when I get back. At this point, you can raise your hand, go ahead, get the notes packet from the sub, and you may get started on your homework. Or not the notes packet, I'm sorry. You may get the homework packet from the sub, and you may start your homework. Have a good day, everyone.